Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Kel Revs, the chess of the best. The adventurer's best friend where you can get everything you want for just your top half off. And tonight, we're talking shop. Episode 19 of the Magnus Protocol. Hang on, for some reason I completely neglected to actually put the title of that episode in my notes. How horribly unprofessional of me. What episode was this again? This was titled Hard Reset. There we go. So, we're finally getting more direction on the motivations behind the players of this world. What the Magnus Institute is researching, what the protocol is, what the OIAR might be trying to stop, what Colin's been up to. And with all of that in mind, we can see just a little bit more of the horizon that this terror train is barreling towards. There's a fair bit to cover, so let's get to it. The episode takes place on April 11th, 2024, one day after the previous episode. Sam and Celia are in the break room with a ladder poring over photocopies of what Sam realizes to be research into alchemy. His deduction catches Celia by surprise, and Sam goes on to note that the one that she's currently looking over has to do with transference and, quote, spiritual substitution of elements, end quote, even pointing out that the research is actually incomplete. He reveals that he became rather familiar with alchemy during his more fervent period of research into the Magnus Institute. Apparently, the Institute was also deeply involved in alchemy research. He asks why Celia is looking into alchemy, to which she responds that it was mostly out of idle curiosity, though there is a slight audio glitch as she says so. Sam, on the other hand, confesses that he's considering dropping his Magnus Institute investigation, though he doesn't discourage Celia from pointing him in the direction of any Institute-related cases she may get. And, like that, we jump into our incident. It's dictated by Chester/John, taking place on March 21st, 1684. This one takes the form of a letter penned by Robert Hooke, as in the historical Fellow of Royal Society and celebrated natural philosopher, to Robert Boyle, as in the historical pioneer of modern chemistry and Fellow of Royal Society, regarding the, quote, enactment of the most regrettable protocol against the fellow Isaac Newton, end quote. Again, another historical pioneer of modern physics. Hooke is reaching out to Boyle after a long period of time, commenting on how their differing opinions on Newton caused them to split, with Hooke respecting Newton's scientific observations and achievements in spite of an apparently dubious moral character. However, he's borne witness to Newton's latest research and found that the enactment of the protocol has become absolutely necessary, that his latest work is unnatural, improper, and even blasphemous, threatening the natural equilibrium of the world. Allegedly. He goes on to discuss the last time the protocol was enacted, commenting on how it was wrong of him, Hooke, to push for restraint and naive of him to have thought that his book Micrographia would remedy what he calls simply that most awful plague. And he concedes that Boyle was right. That, quote, purgation of all that most dangerous and unfit knowledge was both necessary and good, end quote, even if enacting it against the city of London itself was beyond the rights of their positions. He then goes on to describe Newton's work. He'd visited Newton at his lab, where Newton was working feverishly on something while his pet dog wasted away on the floor. It took Hooke quite a bit of effort to gain his attention, despite having been invited there in the first place. Newton takes him to his laboratory, where he reveals a giant flask that glowed with a radiant solution swirling about inside. Trapped inside the solution and swaying in its current was a small tree, seemingly metallic in nature but curiously delicate. Newton explains that he's perfected the work of Wilhelm Homburg to produce the Arbor Philosophorum Perfecta. Hooke marvels at the creation but is unsettled when Newton responds that all of the Lord's living works are elegant in form and shape and nature. After all, how could Newton have created life? Hooke is further disconcerted when Newton offers Hooke to taste the tree's fruit, reaching into the solution and whispering the words, and you'll have to forgive my Latin here, deligno autem scientiae boni et mali necomodas in quocunquam enim de condres ex eo Marte morieris. Google translated from Latin as, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for on whatever day you eat from it, you will die. The words God said to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Soon afterwards, Newton pulls out a small fruit and, watching Hooke's reaction, feeds it to his waiting dog. Hooke watches in horror as the dog slowly transforms, its hairs growing longer and becoming tree-like, digging down into the earth like roots and reaching up like branches. Hooke looks into the eyes of the dog and notes that the eyes held a spark, like the intelligence to be found in his fellow humankind. And in that moment, he decides to bash the dog's head in and kill it, but Newton stops him, pours a little of the solution from the flask onto the dog, and after some hissing and steam, the dog emerges, unscathed, and no longer with the light of human intelligence in his eyes. Hooke is left to wonder what horror would arise if a human ate the fruit. He ends the letter, begging Boyle to join him in torching Newton's lab, but insisting that Newton himself can still be saved as long as they direct his attention to more noble studies and keep their actions secret. He ends it by saying that even if Boyle doesn't join him, even if Hooke doesn't believe himself to be strong enough of character to carry out the deed, he will do it alone, if need be. And the letter ends. Back in the OAR, an unnerved Sam asks Alice for a moment of her time, just as she herself gets an error stopping her from continuing with her caseload. She gets worried when Sam asks to move to the break room, but doesn't move. Sam reveals that he's starting to wonder if the computers are listening to their conversations. He feels that he's been getting more cases related in some way to the Magnus Institute lately, as if the program is directly directing them to him. Alice is amused, saying Sam is going crazy and that he really needs to lock it in a bit or end up like Colin, who still hasn't been to the office. Sam, dejectedly, drops the subject. Meanwhile, Gwen and Lena are having a row. Again. Gwen is expressing her frustration and confusion to Lena about being sent to an isolated location alone to meet with an external. One that Lena told her was so dangerous that it was absolutely stupid that she let it into the OIR to begin with, which implies it to be Lady Mowbray. Gwen doesn't understand why, despite the externals being so dangerous, she's not being given some sort of security. And Lena bites back that it's simply part of the job, that she herself did this work many times in the past. Gwen asks why she can't just have Starkwall accompany her, since they've apparently been working with the OAR in the past, but Lena shoots down the idea, saying that they have a tendency to escalate matters, and that she's much safer without them in the picture. Finally, we cut to Alice as she is knocking on the door of Colin's home. He shakily answers, but demands she give him her phone. She calls him out on this, expecting him to chuck it into the fish tank, and he confesses it to be the truth and his intentions. He says that, quote, "It's the only way to be sure. We can't let him know how much we know," end quote. Alice doesn't play along, as usual, and says that everyone's worried about him. But he shoots back that they should be worried about themselves. Quote, "He sees too much already, doing Mummy and Daddy Stasi proud. Not that anyone cares, as long as it all balances out. Not too much mercury or the world ends, not too much sulfur or we all go mad." End quote. He demands Alice's phone one last time if she wants to talk. She refuses, and he shuts the door, no longer answering Alice as she knocks a few more times before defeatedly remarking on the ridiculousness of what she's dealing with. And, like that, the episode ends. The case is filed Cat 13 RBC 1137-2103 1684-1104-2024. Categorized under Transformation, Subcategory Canine, cross-referenced with Growth Crystalline. So, let's start with the incident. This case takes place in 1684, making it the oldest case by far. In a weirdly exciting twist, this one features historical figures, which is on brand and in character for Magnus, taking historical figures in a world very much like ours and putting them into some massive conspiracy, either as one knowledgeable of the world of darkness creeping beyond humanity's collective consciousness, or as a hand of the eldritch horror itself. Memorable examples being the war poet Wilfred Owens, who turned out to be an avatar of the slaughter, the Russian circus clown Joseph Grimaldi, later Nikola Orsonov, and Hungarian inventor Wolfgang von Kempelen, who were instead grisly servants of the stranger, English astronomer Edmund Halley, later Maxwell Raynor, who was actually a body-hopping servant of the dark, and of course, Robert Smirke, famed architect who was instead a researcher of sorts of the entities, cataloging them and vainly opposing them by keeping them in balance via his architecture. Here, 3 more historical figures appear with an apparent connection to, if not the supernatural, then the events that culminate into the events we're witnessing now and will witness later. Robert Hooke, celebrated scientist, astronomer, geologist, meteorologist, and a pioneer of early microscopic research thanks in no small part to his book Micrographia. Robert Boyle, famous chemist, largely regarded as the first modern chemist, but also known for his work as a natural philosopher, physicist, inventor, and alchemist. And of course, we have Isaac Newton, considered a leader of the scientific revolution whose work informs modern science's understanding of motion, light, and a whole other mess of mathematical laws and theorems, all born from his work as mathematician, physicist, astronomer, as well as his reputation as a theologian and, again, alchemist. This brings our total of historical figures with supernatural extra-historical activities and protocol to 4. Following Sutherland MacDonald, famed British tattooist who, side note, was alive from the mid-1800s to early 1940s, so there's no visible connection to the activities of these 3. At least, not one we could easily deduce. With the historical context out of the way, let's look at what Newton actually achieved. In short, he created something, drawing on and perfecting the work of one Wilhelm Homburg, also a real person, a German natural philosopher from 1652 to 1715, known for his research into alchemical transmutation of precious metals, but also crystallization of salts, research of salts in plants, and other such things. Also, as a side note, natural philosophy refers to the study of nature, science, and the physical universe from a philosophical point of view. Compare it to modern science, which makes a hypothesis about why something occurs the way it does. Then it's tested to determine if it's wrong or not. In contrast to empirical modern science, natural philosophy makes a hypothesis based on observation, but assumes it to be true and works backwards trying to reason out why it could be true. With modern science, you're testing to see if what you think is actually how something works by predicting an outcome and then analyzing why afterwards. With natural science, natural philosophy, You're guessing as to why something happens, then using reason to justify it, which then can be applied to other similar instances. One could argue that approaching Magnus protocol with the assumption that it operates completely the same way as archives, with entities of fear feeding off fear, could be considered a form of natural philosophy. Anyways, Homburg and Newton's work results in the Arbor Philosophorum Perfecta, Latin for the philosopher's perfect tree, if Google Translate is anything to go by. It's a tree suspended in an unknown and radiant solution in a giant flask, the fruit of which, akin to the fruit of knowledge of Abrahamic religions, bestows some flicker of higher knowledge upon those that consume it. At least, such is the belief of Hooke. It also causes the consumer to grow preternaturally, allegedly sprouting roots that grow into the earth and branches that reach up to the sky. Additionally, when the solution is poured on such a consumer of the fruit, the subject is returned to its original state. The transformation has been observed in a canine, but its effect on humans is left to our imagination. So, the big question, of course, becomes, why? Let's look at the goal of classical alchemy. Now, alchemy revolves around the purification of materials, both physical and spiritual. Goals include the transmutation of base metals like lead into noble metals like gold. The creation of an elixir of immortality is also a goal, as well as the creation of panacea capable of curing any disease. That inherent philosophy lends itself well to helping humanity achieving a kind of divinity and, as a science of sorts, the pursuit of knowledge itself. So did Newton seek this knowledge in the pursuit of aiding humanity, to give them this forbidden fruit? Was that why he observed Hooke so closely, to gauge how a colleague would react to such a discovery and decide if the general populace was ready for it? But then, why stop the transformation? Unless he knew it wouldn't end well? He must have tested it beforehand. Or is he looking at the situation from a theologist's point of view? Is he looking at it as a human who judges Adam and Eve's consumption of the fruit of knowledge poorly? To that effect, do the inherent goals of alchemy manifest in Newton as a means of reaching godhood and divinity? The way he talks about how all living creatures being exquisitely elegant by sheer virtue of being created by God, and compares his own work as such, coupled with his recitation of God's words to Adam as he plucks the fruit from within the flask, they seem to point to a subdued God complex. A restrained God who sees the propagation of higher knowledge to be anathema to the well-being of others. It would not be the first time, of course, someone sought supernatural forces as a means of attaining godhood. Certainly not within the universe of Magnus. Think Raynor or Elias. While all avatars might collectively feel the impulse to bring about the change, for many, their motivations and choices were still very much their own. A theme that was strongly explored in the later seasons. Still, while attaining godhood seems plausible for Newton here, there's still room for doubt. If he wants to achieve godhood, why hasn't he partaken of the fruit himself? It's possible he already has, but perhaps deems such knowledge as being too much to share? Or maybe he managed to do so and poured it, happenstance led to him pouring the solution on himself as a result, and he has reverted back and realized that such knowledge should not be sought out? Perhaps? But then there's no observed transformation in him, so, likely not. No scars of sorts are noted. It certainly would not be good practice to test on oneself, though Hooke considers Newton's moral inclinations to be dubious. Yeah, but then again, Hooke historically did not like Newton, so perhaps we shouldn't consider his measure of Newton so reliable. Perhaps the reason that Newton recites God's words to Adam is not to mimic, but rather as a mantra to stop himself. To do what Adam and Eve could not and restrain himself despite feeling urged to do so. That honestly feels a little more likely to me. It seems much more likely that he has not tasted of the fruit, but is deeply considering it and doing everything in his power to stop himself, which, considering how he would later go on to publish a lot of works that would help with the progression of modern science, it would seem to suggest that Hooke and Boyle were successful in diverting his attentions away to more noble pursuits. Perhaps it's because this theme of knowledge, right, makes him and his preservation, as well as pursuit of knowledge itself, it just seems to tie the episode really well to both Protocol and Archives, more so than maybe a couple of episodes lately. With that being said, we can talk about the themes present here. Going off the classical entities, we have themes of the eye, with the pursuit of knowledge, the potential threat of what that higher knowledge can do to you, and the need for keeping this knowledge secret. This obviously helps to justify the episode's dictation by Chester John. The corruption is arguably present in the form of the dog transforming into the tree. Funnily enough, it's not the first time in Protocol something was turned into a plant. Back in episode 3, Putting Down Roots, a doctor was slowly turned into a tree. Though the transformation was far more infectious in nature, much more rooted in fear and terror with explicit plant-like characteristics. Here the case is filed under transformation crystalline, and while the branches are described as sprouting, they're also described as radiant, likely similar to the light from the flask, so the transformation may not quite be the same and therefore not really be an application of the corruption. But still, the corruption remains present in the mention of a plague in London, which we'll touch upon later. The extinction is also present in the form of Hooke's fear of the dog gaining a level of sentience and intelligence potentially equal to humanity's. He fears what could happen to a human if they consumed the fruit. Perhaps they would be supplanted by whatever the result would be, which, of course, one would have to question to begin with. What would they become? What would they know? And of course, as I mentioned, it's possible that Newton possesses that fear as well, which may be what stops him from actually consuming the fruit for himself, if he truly hasn't consumed the fruit. And lastly, as if to emphasize my own ramblings, yet again, there is a theme of obsession underlying all of it. In this case, an obsession with knowledge and the pursuit of said knowledge. After all, Newton was so hyperfixated on his research that Hooke actually had to go through several pains, had to noisily announce himself in order to tear his attention away. It really blends into the eye quite well in this particular instance. But, as continues to be the case with these protocol cases, the star revelation isn't in the possible entity involvement. In this case, the subject of keen interest is the grand conspiracy happening in the background of protocol and the protocol itself. We now know that the protocol dates as far back as the 1600s, with the big players Robert Hooke and Robert Boyle being heavily involved. As fellows of Royal Society, it stands to reason that membership really is in the upper echelons of society and government. But it seems being a fellow doesn't guarantee that kind of membership. Talks of positions suggest that there might be some sort of hierarchy even then. We know that they've enacted the protocol at least once in the past, with Hooke and Boyle being involved in that instance, and that it was enacted upon the city of London itself. Apparently, it was in response to an awful plague. If it was in response to an awful plague, then looking at the time period that Hooke and Boyle were alive, this points to the Great Plague of London, the last outbreak of the bubonic plague, which took place roughly from 1665 to 1666. Now, what I find interesting is that Hooke thought that his book Micrographia would remedy the situation. I can't help but wonder if he was going about it based off of archive rules. Maybe he was hoping that by giving the general populace a glimpse of microorganisms like bugs and cells, then it might curtail their fear of disease, therefore reduce the spread of the plague. In other words, the corruption is involved. But Hooke thought he could stop it via reducing the fear with knowledge. Obviously, it didn't work, so they enacted the protocol. And from there, it's not hard to figure out what that entails. 1666 is famous in history as the year of the Great London Fire. In other words, the protocol is literally just arson. In response to the spreading plague, they set fire to the city itself and just burned it out. You know, the method draws parallels with Archives' Gertrude Robinson's methodology for disrupting the schemes of the entities. And thus, they elect to enact the protocol again on Newton's laboratory. And if history is any indication, allegedly, Newton once said that his laboratory did in fact catch fire one day, which resulted in the loss of 20 years worth of research, apparently. There are claims of it being his dog having done so by accident, but also claims of that Newton had simply left a candle burning in his laboratory that fell over due to wind from an open window. Now, such as it goes, regardless, it's not unreasonable to assume that the protocol succeeded based on our own history. Though, without proper proof or evidence of his work's destruction, we can't be too cautious that the Arbor Philosophorum Perfecta won't make another appearance. But with confirmation of what the protocol is, we can more or less point at any fires in protocol and say that is the protocol in action. Obviously, there's the Great London Fire of 1666, likely to be a response to the spreading bubonic plague, though there is a possibility that Hooke was trying to fight against something else, considering he describes the danger as, quote, dangerous and unfit knowledge. Whatever that means, we don't actually have anything to inform us on what that could be. Newton's lab, obviously, must have been torched for its forbidden knowledge. And then, of course, in the modern day, we have the Magnus Institute as a possibility as well. A very strong possibility instead of a random isolated instance. With an apparent interest in alchemy, the comparisons to Newton are impossible to avoid. This also means that the Institute was truly independent and free of any shady government connections. Or, at the very least, the OIR and the Institute did not share a positive relationship with each other, therefore allowing me to immediately cross off my hypothesis and prediction that the Institute and what served as a branch of the OIR or even its response unit. Now we know that it's not possible. There's also the Oxford People's Trust Hilltop Center, which was burned down by a security task force, likely Starkwall, back in episode 7, Give and Take. That instance saw many artifacts and antiques being torched, with all the bizarre volunteers being massacred alongside it. Now, presuming this to be an enactment of the protocol, the motivation seems a little different, with knowledge not seeming to be the key goal of destruction. It's still possible that the web is trying to make use of that space and try to crack it open with such an act of horror, but assuming that's true, did the secret society tasked with preventing these things see a bunch of activity and just scramble to deal with it? Or did they already know what was happening and finally chose to act? Or is it not an instance of the protocol? Which I kind of think is highly unlikely. Still, it seems that the goal of destruction here is a little different. Lastly, we have to consider this San Pedro Square massacre. We still have no idea what this is. And with no idea, we can't make any judgments and certainly can't call it a protocol enactment. We need more information for this one specifically, but I imagine we'll probably get it. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that gets left to the imagination for effect. But that's all the protocol enactments we could reasonably point to. It seems pretty obvious. They are the only ones that really have fire in their statements, but at the very least, that also means that any instance of fire, specifically with any case that seems to suggest protocol enactment, doesn't necessarily connect to the desolation anymore. Instead, it is a targeted action meant to facilitate, or rather curtail, the propagation of either knowledge, forbidden or otherwise, or supernatural spooky going-ons in the case of the Hilltop Center. But it really does seem to come down to destroying forbidden knowledge in the end. Or perhaps this is more a means of stopping entities and their agents before they can really get the ball going for their hidden agendas. Though it's possible they were too slow with the plague and Hilltop Center. But once again, I'm drawn to comparisons with Gertrude Robinson. Alright? I can't help but wonder if this universe was born from a writer asking themselves what would happen if we scaled up Gertrude Robinson from an individual to an organization with the resources and greater knowledge to stop rituals long before they're underway. Like, maybe a writer asked what would happen if Gertrude Robinson or someone like her had more resources and support than an independent academic institute that's run by one of the very things they're trying to stop. Of course, that still assumes that this secret society, of which the OAR is likely an arm of, has no other secret agendas other than managing the bad guys. And of course, this still leaves the question of whether or not the OAR is a stronghold of the eye. But once again, I will reiterate that I still feel like it's the opposite and that the eye is actually targeting the OIAR, which would make sense considering that it seems the secret society behind it is managing the bad guys. It would make sense that perhaps the greater factions may not take kindly to these actions. Speaking of secret agendas, alchemy. Interesting angle to have the story focus on that. So, tattoos and alchemy are to protocol what books and architecture are to archives? Most likely they're just expanding the possibilities of how the entities interact with the material world, but still, wasn't ready for alchemy. Nor was I ready for it to be an apparent focus of the Magnus Institute. So, why were they looking into alchemy? I mentioned that purification of materials, immortality, and curing diseases tie in well with godhood and divinity. The addition of a fruit of higher knowledge further elevates this interpretation. Assuming this institute was founded by Jonah Magnus, and assuming that, like Darien and his other version, that this Jonah Magnus has a similar personality, motivations, and background, it would be completely in character for Jonah to have been seeking godhood. But perhaps in this world he chose to do so through alchemy. I feel like we need to see more of the archives if that's the case, or just more information. Like, does the institute have the same motto of "I listen, I wait, I watch"? Like, that could inform us a little more about the motivations of the institute, their methodology, and tell us exactly what well, not exactly, but a hint of the motivations of its founder. Of course, the presence of paranoia in the few individuals who have visited the Institute still leads me to believe a strong presence of the eye still. But with no leads, we have nowhere to go with the why. If we could just get one account or case or incident that involves the founder of the Institute directly, then we could more easily start to unravel the motivations behind the Institute's founding. We're probably not going to get that for a while, though. And when we do finally get it, it's probably going to be a crumb, if nothing else. We can, however, start to look a little more closely at the cases we have gotten. Regarding its mentions in the background, suddenly the strange symbols that appeared in the Institute as mentioned in the first episode make more sense. Symbols of no known language never figured into archives, but here it's a sign of the Institute's connection to alchemy. It narrows the scope of snake symbology as well when looking at episode 14, Pet Projects. Snakes call to mind the cycle of rebirth, as well as the Ouroboros, the famous symbol of a snake eating its own tail, which has its own meaning in alchemy as well. And then there's the assessment that Magnus statements start with. From the point of view of experimentation, subject viability might not be about an object's potential to be studied as I had suggested, but instead its potential as the main component in an alchemical reaction, the substance that will be transformed. Agent viability might not be whether an object or person is an avatar. Instead, it might be the potential of an object to react with the subject, the component consumed in the reaction. And then catalyst viability, it's right there. More natural, it naturally slots in as a component to speed up the reaction and transformation of the subject as induced by the agent. With that in mind, the dice's viability as a subject is none because its volume is too small to be used as a main component. It would be consumed first due to its low volume, making its agent viability low. But for some reason, it has better potential as a catalyst, set at medium, which is why it's recommended for catalytics to assess for enrichment applicability. Why? Well, we'll have to wait till something with a higher catalyst viability shows up so we can draw comparisons. As for Darian, all assessments for him are low, but now we know it could be for different reasons. As a subject, he has potential by sheer virtue of being from a different universe. His molecular makeup is itself different compared to natives of this universe. Or it could be if we're going off of the assumption that Celia is still an interdimensional traveler. An interdimensional being certainly could garner interest from an alchemical point of view. His viability as an agent and catalyst, well, that could just simply stem from a human sacrifice point of view of transforming something into something else. His potential incarceration as part of the Mutaria Materia program means that either way, he was slated to be part of some kind of transformation, transmutation, reaction. But what? While these clues don't give us too much insight on why the Institute is doing what it does, well, I guess the best we can really do is speculate. And here are my thoughts on the matter. Alchemy in the Institute is being used as a means of enacting the change in the world instead of an avatar. If, as I had suggested, the eye does recall what happened in the universe of archives, then perhaps it wants to try a different method of enacting change by creating something other than an avatar. I played with the idea of artifacts being used to speedrun cracking open the gap in reality, though by who it could actually be the web or the eye being more of curiosity and the web being a planner, of course. But as a keystone of the change, an object might serve better than an avatar. Unlike an avatar, especially an unwilling one, an object would have no means of rebelling. But how it would even be marked by all the entities is a puzzling issue, one that maybe the Institute was wrestling with. Another speculation I have is that the Institute is trying to recreate the fruit of the philosopher's tree. What if the fruit does grant omniscience in a human being? If it does, what could that mean for a person? Knowledge of everything as it exists? as it always had or ever will. There's plenty of talk about how the OIAR may be making a ritual impossible by separating the entities into as many possible iterations and blends as possible. That way, to be marked by all of them would be impossible, and therefore to bring them into the world becomes impossible as they all travel together and all would require an anchor in the physical plane. But with omniscient knowledge, to know all that there is and ever will be, that kind of higher knowledge could potentially mark someone with every fear, even as it expands into blends and different forms, allowing for the existence of an avatar of all fear. And with the potential goal of attaining godhood, perhaps it would elevate one above the status of avatar. But of course, this all presumes the impulsed goal of bringing them into the world. For now, all we know is that the OIR and the secret society it's part of is trying to stop the propagation of forbidden knowledge. For all we know, that forbidden knowledge might be for some other kind of goal. It might be wise to wait until the bad guys tip their hand a little more for us. After looking at natural philosophy and its differences with empirical science, one can't help but feel, well, I can't help but feel like maybe making the same assumptions that were present in archives is, once again, just one of the biggest traps when looking at and predicting what could happen in protocol. I've talked about this with regards to looking at the entities in their classical format from archives and trying to apply that here to protocol. Obviously, that's not going to work because at this point, we're already used to blended fears and we already know how important it is to acknowledge that the fears blend with each other. So perhaps there's room for us to also question whether the entities want to be brought into the world. Again, knowing, as we do, what could happen if they succeeded. But again, that's for us to leave for the future episodes to dwell upon. As for the rest of the office, Celia is interested in alchemy. It seems like a sudden jump from interdimensional cases, but perhaps the purifying of materials and the spiritual could be tangentially tied to the weird physics that Celia seemed so interested in. Obviously, she's more than just curious about alchemy, but we can't really point to why she's actually hyperfixated on it. At the very least, it's likely she's trying to understand how her teleporting works, and maybe is trying to control it. Honestly, I'm starting to consider the possibility that she's not... I'm starting to reconsider, right? And I've been reconsidering the possibility of her being interdimensional, but even if she were an interdimensional traveler, I can't help but question whether she's actually tasked with stopping entities as part of some interdimensional crusade like I suggested episodes ago. Gwen is probably meeting Lady Mowbray. Lena is still disrespecting Gwen, and the insistence of going alone without security probably is going to make Gwen feel emotionally isolated as well. Now, I still think Lena is trying to deduce Gwen's source this way, or see how the program reacts, but again, with the presence of the eye being so... the role of the eye, right, and paranoia and spying being so questionable with regards to how it operates within the OIAR as a tool or as a foe, still rolling around in my brain, and I'm still not so sure. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm still also convinced that Gwen's isolation will be exploited by Lady Mowbray in some way. Perhaps to have a mole in the OIAR. And I feel that Gwen will eventually start to lean more towards her side. You know, the side that possibly makes her feel good about herself. Like, I really do think that Lady Mowbray, as pretty much a hunter and a member of higher society, it's really easy for me to really see her manipulating Gwen with some conversational nudging, essentially. Silk hiding steel, as it were. It, specifically through words. And I stand by this prediction. At least until I'm convinced otherwise by subsequent episodes and actions that she may or may not take. But I wouldn't mind being wrong about this one because, you don't want to see them side with the bad guys. The bad guys. But yeah. Also, I can't help but feel weirdly triumphant about how Starkwall was mentioned when I said last time, literally last episode, we'd probably hear about them again. Now, granted, it wasn't on Georgie's podcast like I suggested, but still. I'm sure that Georgie podcast will turn up sooner or later. And on that note, we got confirmation that they are, in fact, heavily connected with the OIAR. I mean, we already had that early on when we first heard of the mysterious protocol, but now we can at least confirm from the mouth of the person in charge herself that they are connected to the AR. And we can also confirm that they're, strictly speaking, not an external in the same sense as Lady Mowbray or Mr. Bonzo. Considering how Gwen wanted them as a security detail. Their tendency to escalate, however, is worrying. Speaking of worrying, Sam is starting to pick up on the fact that he's in a horror podcast with themes of paranoia and spying. It doesn't seem that naive. Or rather, it does seem a bit naive that he wouldn't think that a government department that's passively spying on the citizens for horror stories is spying on him and the rest of them. But it's not like I don't get his sentiment in my everyday life. I mean, you know how it is. You're talking to a friend about marriage, for example, and suddenly your social media is bombarded with ads for wedding rings or tuxedos or whatever. It's pretty spooky sometimes. But we know Sam's character. We know he wasn't going to drop the Magnus Institute investigation. Sam's curiosity will get the better of him. He might get unnerved by the cases going to him, but he's not gonna stop. It's his obsession. Obsession seems to be the key word when it comes to this series. And Sam's just not gonna stop. He's not gonna stop until it breaks him permanently, for sure. But now, the question is, does him knowing that is being spied upon, I mean, as sure, he's probably going to be somewhat satisfied, always getting if he gets the information that he wants and the information that he's looking for. But does the spy or being monitored, will that concern him enough to look into why he's getting this information? Who might be giving him that information? That part. That's the part that I'm actually not so sure about. I imagine his curiosity will drive him to ask why and drive him to look into why, but I'm not so sure because it feels like the priority is the Magnus Institute. Just something for us to look forward to seeing how it plays out, I suppose. Another thing to look forward to how it plays out. Now, in contrast, Colin, he is alive. So there's that. But he's a paranoid mess. Maybe not a wreck just yet, but he's a mess. I wonder if it's eye-induced or just all natural. He seems to have some inkling of who might be watching him through their devices as well. He says that they can't let him know how much they know, that he sees too much. Colin says that he must be making the Stasi proud. So, we now know who he suspects. With the Stasi being the secret police or security force of East Germany, and given his intimate knowledge of the program, Freddy, or as intimate as it possibly can be, it seems he suspects his predecessor, the German, presumed dead but secretly dodged his own murder by Lena, former IT manager of the OIR, Klaus. No last name given still. But why does Colin think it's him? How plausible is that? Sure, apparently the source code for Freddy was in German, and Colin learned German to try and figure out the system, and in doing so, learned Klaus's motivations. There's a grudge against Lena, which could justify why the blackmail video was sent to Gwen, with it being possible maybe Klaus learned to use the system externally. But would he send it to Gwen? When he and Gwen have never even met? Colin also doesn't trust Lena enough to tell her he's been in the office, so why wouldn't Klaus go to the guy that is seemingly also not a fan of the OIR? And what about the email that Sam got from John regarding Gertrude and Jared's address? Is that also Klaus? Or is it not? Why would Klaus give him that kind of information if he's hacked into the system and accessing it? If the OAR's goal is to control information, then that means Lena was tasked with killing Klaus for knowing something. That much is obvious, but the question remains, what does he know? What can he do with that knowledge? And with that knowledge, why would he reach out to OIAR employees and nudge them in the directions of paranoia, in Colin's case, a promotion, in Gwen's case, and the Magnus Institute in Sam's case? Perhaps it could be justified with Sam as maybe seeking forbidden knowledge, therefore justifying why the OAR would want to nip him out of the picture permanently. But what about the others? What about Gwen and Colin? What does Colin mean as well? What does he mean when he talks about the world needing a balance? Too much mercury or the world ends, too much sulfur or we all go mad. It seems odd to bring up specific elements and compounds when we just finished up talking about alchemy. The way he describes it, it's almost, I don't know, if I were to get really, really crazy with my speculation, I would say that he's making it seem like the world itself is actually trapped in a flask, similar to the one Newton created, surrounded by some unseeable, unfeelable solution that would react differently depending on what ingredients are present. But why? Right? Why would that be the direction this, it's probably not. I'm like 99% sure that is not the angle that this story is going to go in the end, right? But then, like, what is Colin talking about? What is he talking about? We don't know, right? We don't know if Colin's actually got something to back up his beliefs and or claims, or if it's just paranoia. And not misplaced paranoia, just mutated into something less coherent. Either way, Colin's not sharing what he knows. Klaus is doing a great job of hiding himself, and everything else is just being fed to us piecemeal, bit by bit, leaving us to try and figure out what the puzzle is without having a full picture to go off of. And the only picture that we have is from archives, which is a completely different edition of this puzzle, so it doesn't really mean anything. But with Colin avoiding cameras, phones, and whatnot, despite being probably the closest to answers that we could potentially get, much like Lena, he's not going to tell us, and we're not going to find out for him. At least not willingly. The way I see it, the way that we could get information from Colin specifically is if he slips up somewhere after devolving so much that he forgets to be careful. Maybe he gets tricked, or much like we all tend to assume regarding Colin, we might learn from him posthumously. Really, the outcomes for Colin have never looked good, but it really does feel like his odds of surviving to the end of the series seem to get worse with every appearance he makes. But who knows? Maybe the paranoia may serve him well in the end. It served Mikhail Salesa pretty well up until an unexpected twist happened, but his paranoia proved to serve him well. But with that said, we're going to leave it there. This episode was really fun for me, analysis-wise, just because I delved into a couple of Wikipedia rabbit holes. It was fun, but it did take a while. I feel like I'm adding a lot each time because I feel I need to cross-reference my previous claims to see how they hold up, if they hold up, or if they need to be adjusted or dropped altogether. One thing's for sure, this series is still surprising me, and I am loving it. Next episode should drop in a couple of hours. I'll give it a listen. I hope you guys give it a listen, and I will see y'all next week for the next episode of Talking Shop. In the meantime, if you have theories or predictions that you want to share, or you have something to add regarding mine, don't hesitate to comment. If you're watching the VODs on YouTube, obviously follow Rusty Quill for their other content, and sub and follow here if you feel like hearing me drone on. With that being said, guys, shop's closed. Get out. Bye-bye, guys.